Hi everyone, I'm John Bifulki, Research Manager at SpecialEurasia, and today we are with a distinguished guest. He is Mark Youngman. Hi Mark.
Hi there, thanks for having me.
Mark is an open source intelligence analyst and independent researcher. He has been working on Russia and Eurasia for more than 15 years, at first as an OSINT analyst for the USA government, then as a senior lecturer at UK University, and now is the founder of Threatologist. We decided to invite Mark because of his experience and expertise on Russia, particularly in the North Caucasus. Recently, Mark released an interesting report regarding security and terrorism in the North Caucasus in 2024. I had the opportunity to read it, and so we wanted to ask more information, more insight regarding the region that SpecialEurasia has been covering for years, thanks to our project Caucasus Files. So, Mark, the first questions for you is that in your recent reports, so you underline some key regional trends that you identify concerning the evolution of terrorism activities and counter-insurgency measures. So, can you tell more about these aspects and how do these trends compare with previous years?
Okay, sure. So there's really 5 key trends that I would highlight as particularly standing out from the data. The first of them is simply the volume of incidents that were seen in 2024 and what we can say is quite an upsurge in the levels of violence experienced by the region. So across the whole year, there were a total of 93 incidents, and they resulted in, depending which sources you use, between 82 and 122 casualties. So that's quite a high level of violence. Now, this report is based on a unique data set that I compiled, so I've only got the data that's directly comparable for 2024. But looking at reliable sources for 2023, they speak of only 9 incidents and 27 casualties. So that's quite a significant increase that you're seeing from 9 to 93. That reporting at best will have missed 1 or 2 smaller incidents, but it wouldn't have missed anything on a larger scale. So we see quite a significant uptick, and that's kind of the first main conclusion. The second one is that we see in the region the biggest event that we've seen for quite a few years, and that was the terrorist attacks in Makhachkala and Derbent in June. And I think that's something we're going to come back to, so I won't go into too much detail on that. Now, that does distort those casualty figures quite a bit. That one incident accounts for between 55 and 60% of the overall figures that you see for the year. If we were to take it out, you're still talking about a huge increase in the number of incidents and a significant increase in the number of casualties. But I don't think we really should take it out of the equation, because it's a bit like considering terrorism in the US and discounting 9/11. Yes, it does distort figures, but you can't really take it out of the equation. So that's number 2, is you've got this huge event, the largest that we've seen for quite some time. The third conclusion and key finding is that it's really the security services that are the main driver of the violence. So looking at who initiated incidents, they account for nearly 90% of the incidents. So when we're looking at the security picture in the region, then we're really talking as much about counterterrorism as we are terrorism itself. So that's number 3. Number 4 is that we do see some geographic concentration of violence. So even though we see incidents across the North Caucasus as a whole, really there's a concentration in Dagestan as the largest republic and Ingushetia. And those 2 republics account for about 65% of the total. So they're having a significant impact on that whole regional picture. And then the final thing, which I did hesitate to include because it's not really a terrorism and counter-terrorism aspect, but it's the rise of drone attacks in the region. And so from October onwards, we start to see drone attacks occurring in the region. The main target was Chechnya and the Chechen security services. You do see kind of isolated incidents elsewhere. Now, for the most part, they're almost certainly linked to the Ukrainian armed forces and forming part of that conflict, which is why I hesitated to include them. But I think if you're considering the overall kind of security situation in the region, it is kind of a degree of innovation, and it's a degree of targeting the very same actors that a lot of the terrorist attacks are targeting, namely the security services. And there's also the potential for kind of innovation and replication. And we don't know for certain that it's the Ukrainian armed forces. We do have some attribution, but we don't know for definite. So it could be, for example, groups in support of the Ukrainian cause carrying out the attacks. So that's, I think, is significant. But as much as the use of drones is significant, I think it's the potential for the reaction to the use of drones to be significant. The most obvious example was the incident involving the Azerbaijani airline that crashed in Kazakhstan. That was as a result of the anti-drone air defense systems. And so you see the potential for kind of reaction and then that having significant consequences. So that's really what I'd highlight as the 5 things. You've got the upsurge in violence, you've got the fact you've got the biggest incident seen for many years, you've got the security services kind of driving the violence, you've got the geographic concentration in Dagestan and Ingushetia, and then you've got the emergence of this new phenomenon, which is the drone attacks.
So thanks for this overview regarding the trends in the North Caucasus, also regarding your reports. So, as you highlight in the report, there were 2 main terrorist attacks. The first was at Krakow City Hall in Moscow in March 2024. The second one was in Dagestan, in Makhachkala and Derbent. So can you provide us more information regarding the tactics, techniques, and also the meaning of these 2 terrorist attacks for Russia and for the general security of the country?
Sure. So the first thing I'd highlight is that these attacks are significant in and of themselves. So even if you kind of put aside the broader implications for a moment, the fact that you've got these large-scale terrorist attacks happening, the first one in Moscow, the second one in Dagestan, it's relatively unusual. It's become increasingly unusual in Russia to see attacks of that size. They were the largest attacks that Russia has experienced for many years, and certainly since the decline of the Caucasus Emirate and the Caucasus Vilayet. So I think first of all we need to look at the incidents in and of themselves as being things of significant. Then I think what is particularly noteworthy about these attacks is the fact that they are attacks involving relatively large numbers of attackers. And in the case of the Dagestani attacks, they're happening simultaneously across multiple locations. So you see them within Makhachkala and within Derbent attacking different facilities more or less at the same time. And the reason that's noticeable is because even if you go back to the 2010s, when you had a relatively vibrant insurgency in the North Caucasus, as that insurgency progressed, it became increasingly difficult for it to organize attacks on any scale. So it was relatively rare to see incidents that involved double figures. And even if you look at the highest casualty attacks, so some of the suicide attacks, for example, they're still involving low numbers of perpetrators. They just have high numbers of casualties. And carrying out attacks across multiple locations was also extremely difficult. And when the insurgency did try to collaborate across locations, that usually led to counter-terrorism operations and the annihilation of the groups. So the fact that you're seeing more coordination between groups is something of concern. And that kind of flags another area of concern, which is the relatively slow and questionable competence of the security service response to these incidents. So once the incidents occur, the speed with which the security services are able to mobilize and neutralize the threat, what we see is it's not particularly effective, and that contributes to the high casualty figures. And I think in the Dagestani case, it's particularly noticeable because the police who were attacked when they were supposed to be guarding churches and synagogues, and they were placed there as a heightened security measure in the first place. And that's a response to the pogroms at Makhachkala airport that stemmed from Hamas's attacks on Israel in October 23 now. And so it's not that the security services aren't aware that there could be violence, because they're there specifically to deal with it, and yet even in that circumstance they seem to be relatively incompetent and inefficient. And I think that means what we can do is we can look at it and we can say, is this a case of there being an increased threat from radicalized groups, from terrorist groups, or is it a case of there being a declining capability in the security services' ability to respond to events? And I tend to incline towards the latter, because if you look at the North Caucasus, there's always been that kind of low-level willingness to engage in armed struggle. It's not that those groups enjoy a great deal of support, it's not that they're representative, but you see continually, even after the annihilation of kind of organized groups, there's still this sporadic violence, sporadic continual regular attacks that testifies to this low-level support for violence. So I think that's always been there, but the security services' capability to respond to it has declined. I think Ukraine has had an impact on that, and the kind of the distraction of the security services' attention. And I also think that the security services, they're simply less good at the intelligence gathering side of things, because when there were organized groups, they were able to penetrate them and gather information. And I think they're much less effective at doing that. And so what you see is this kind of degradation of the state's capabilities in dealing with the terrorism threat. And I would place that above kind of a significant escalation in the terrorist threat itself. I can't hear you.
So I was telling you, thanks for this answer. And you mentioned the Islamic State Wilayat Caucasus. So there are many rumors, many articles. So people say that Islamic State has been penetrating the North Caucasus or not. We also wrote a report regarding Telegram channels publishing a sort of manifesto of the Hingush Jamaat, which was inviting people to, to support the Islamic State. But what is the real presence or level of the Islamic State? It's just like an idea, a theory, it's just jihadist propaganda, or we can talk really about the presence of Islamic State operatives on the ground in the North Caucasus?
Mm-hmm. So I think when we're talking about the threat posed by the Islamic State, we need to separate out the Islamic State and the Caucasus Vilayat. Not because the Caucasus Vilayat is no longer part of the Islamic State and has broken away from it, but because, to my mind, the Caucasus Vilayat just doesn't exist anymore, except as kind of this digital idea. Organized insurgency, that infrastructure for insurgency, the existence of specific groups who are able to support operations of an identified leadership, that hasn't existed in the North Caucasus since the end of 2017. So just to give your listeners and viewers kind of a brief recap of that kind of evolution of the insurgency in the region, in 2007, you see the formal transformation of what was the Chechen separatist struggle into an explicitly jihadist project and the creation of the Caucasus Emirate. And the Caucasus Emirate was that big umbrella group organizing armed struggle in the North Caucasus. And it remained that until 2014-2015. The Caucasus Emirate ceased to exist in August 2015 when the last of its leaders were killed, but really it had been in quite rapid decline since December 2014 when large numbers of leaders of the Caucasus Emirate defected, joined the Islamic State, and they set up the Caucasus Vilayat. But that only lasted until, I would say, December 2017, when by which point the most prominent, the known leaders on the ground had all been killed. The leader of the Caucasus Vilayat, who was the Dagestani emir, he had been killed. After that point, that organizational insurgency no longer exists. What I think you see after that is basically lots of relatively isolated incidents that are inspired by the ideology of the Islamic State and just jihadism more broadly. They're acting in the name of that ideology. There is some evidence of kind of digital cooperation, communication, for example, with actors in Syria. But in terms of operational support, it's relatively limited, and in terms of an infrastructure, it's non-existent. So it becomes a very different threat from that point forward. And I would kind of characterize it as a very similar type of threat to that seen in Western countries, where you see support for kind of terrorism, you see terrorist violence carrying out, but you're not really talking about, no one talks about like an insurgency in London or an insurgency in America. You know, it's a different type of violence. It's slightly more elevated in Russia, in parts because of the size of the communities involved and the kind of the levels of support for it, but it's a very similar phenomenon to my mind. In that regard, I mean, I would note that it's not just a North Caucasian phenomenon as well. So this does take us outside of kind of the things that I discussed specifically in the report, but you see a big problem with kind of radicalization within Central Asian communities. Even within some of those operations in the North Caucasus, actually some of the people arrested were Central Asian, even natives, migrants, who are acting in the name of the Islamic State. And I think the Crocus City Hall attack is indicative of why we can talk of the Islamic State, but not the Caucasus Vilayat, because that was actually traced back to the Khorasan Vilayat, not the Caucasus Vilayat. So it's not even coming from the same sources in that regard. And if you look at the Dagestani attacks, I mean, yes, the Islamic State, they praised the attack, but they didn't actually claim it. They didn't say we were behind it. They didn't give anything that would indicate that they had any advanced knowledge of it. So for me, like the Islamic State, jihadism more broadly, it's much more kind of an ideology that people can get behind to justify their struggle. And they might have some digital communications, but I don't think we should talk about it as being an insurgency anymore. And I think a lot of the media reporting does tend to be a bit misleading in this regard, because there's a tendency, if something happens in the North Caucasus, it's spoken of using the language of insurgency, of militants, as if it's a continuation of what went on historically. And it's very much not. It's very much akin to what you see elsewhere in Russia and in other countries. So, yeah, I mean, I would really kind of emphasize that there is no organizational infrastructure anymore. And that's something that we need to bear in mind when we're considering what does jihadist violence, what does insurgent violence look like in the region these days?
Thanks. So you published this report regarding North Caucasus. So my question is why is it so important in North Caucasus, and how this region can be also important and functional regarding Russian security? Because, you know, especially Eurasia, we reported several times regarding North Caucasus because we believe it's a bridge between Europe and Asia, but also frontier. between Russia and other area, and Russia has invested a lot in the region since 2010, but also has organized after the beginning of Ukraine conflict several forums to attract investments and also to link the North Caucasus with the MENA region and Africa and also Central Asia. So why this report is so important and how the North Caucasus can play a significant role in Russian security system?
Well, so I think if you look at the North Caucasus, it's an area that, the interest and the attention, particularly outside Russia, that people pay to the region very much fluctuates. So you see like sudden surges around particular incidents or particular events, for example, like the World Cup or the Sochi Olympics, where people suddenly focus attention on it. And then people turn their attention away from the region. But I think it's worth kind of bearing in mind that it is still Russia's kind of predominant domestic security threat. So obviously now the attention is very much on Ukraine and what's happening in Ukraine. But the threat of terrorism is still widespread across Russia as a whole. You are seeing relatively large numbers of attacks, but also continual detentions of people, the use of terrorism as a form of suppression as well. So, you can talk about the use of court cases as a way of like silencing dissent, and the way that the terrorism label can be very useful in that regard. So it has a huge impact on the domestic situation. And even if you're looking at Ukraine, you can't really separate the two entirely, because within the Ukraine conflict, you've got North Caucasian groups that are engaged in armed struggle against Russia, and they're fighting on the side of Ukraine, and fighting against them are Chechen security services. And so what you have there, similar to what you saw in Syria, is a form of basically displaced conflict where, okay, they're no longer fighting in the North Caucasus, but they're now fighting elsewhere. And if you ask most of these groups, if you had the chance to go back to Russia, if the conditions in Russia in the North Caucasus enabled you to, would you go back and fight? Then a lot of them will say quite explicitly, yes. They will say Russia is our enemy and we are fighting Russia, and if we can go home, we will go home. It's the situation on the ground, the security situation, the operational difficulties that have precluded that. But I think it's very easy for people to lose interest in the North Caucasus when they don't see something happening. But then all of a sudden something happens and people go, well, where did that come from? And it's like, well, if you pay attention in the meantime, that will give you the indicators. And that's why I think tracking projects of the sort that I've done for this report, that's why I find them particularly valuable, because it's very easy to lose sight of the significance of developments. If I spoke of 93 incidents. If you look at most of the incidents individually, they're relatively small scale. They don't attract a lot of media attention. There'll be one or two reports, this incident happened. But what it means, how it fits in a broader security picture is no one's paying attention to it, and it kind of just falls off the radar. And so people who aren't paying attention to the North Caucasus wouldn't necessarily have noticed that there's this massive increase compared to 2023. And it's only when you collate the data that you can start to see these trends emerging. You can start to see these kind of indicators that there is an area of concern. And if you wait until you have a Crocus City Hall attack, or you have a Boston Marathon bombing, or something major, and then say, well, we need the data to say how does this fit in kind of long-term trends? What does this mean for the broader security situation? All of a sudden you don't have the data. It's too late to start when there's the major incidents. So I think you can sadly say with a degree of confidence that there will continue to be instability in the North Caucasus, and it will continue to have repercussions for Russia and the broader regional security picture. And that's why you need to kind of pay attention when these like low-scale incidents are happening. And that's without getting into the kind of the broader questions of why the region matters in terms of the way that the North Caucasus and in particular Chechnya influences Russian politics, the replication of certain strategies in Ukraine that were tested in the North Caucasus first, the role of the Caucasus in Russia's foreign policy and the way that it performs that bridge, like you say, with the Muslim world and the way that Ramzan Kadyrov in particular positions himself as a Muslim leader. All of those things are kind of additional to the situation around terrorism and insurgency, but they're all kind of related in some way, because one key claim for Ramzan Kadyrov's legitimacy is that he defeated terrorism in the North Caucasus. So a resurgence of terrorism undermines his legitimacy in a way. And so, yeah, I mean, obviously I'm biased. I've worked on the region since 2008. I would be inclined to argue that it's important, but the region has a habit of reminding you that it's important at various stages throughout Russia's history.
Thanks. Let's also say that finding sources is not easy. It's not easy because the majority of the sources is in Russian language, so people should at least understand the language. And if I remember in the past, the West, Europe, United States, they were more interested in the North Caucasus, particularly during the so-called Second Chechen conflict. I still remember, like, Jamestown Foundation had the North Caucasus Weekly, and they produce report every week. And also Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty was covering the region with more attention, not just Chechnya, but the entire region. But now, in Russia, you can find different articles, different reports, but unfortunately, if they are from Russia, from inside Russia, sometimes they are not objective, and sometimes they relate to official authorities. So I'm telling you this because I would like to know more about the methodologies that you apply regarding the open source intelligence activities when you collect sources and when you collect the data, and also how can you classify the sources, if they are reliable or not, if they can use in the way you can use. So also because I'm asking this question because SpecialEurasia, of course, apply open source intelligence methodologies and tools, and also because we have some training programs in open source intelligence. For us, what is really important is like the methodology to classify the sources and also to understand if the information they provide can be reliable or not, or partially reliable, particularly when we talk about Russia. So some more information regarding your methodologies and how you operate on the ground, like when you want to understand more about the source on the information.
Yeah, so I should say, first of all, so anyone who wants to read the report, they can just go to my website, which is www.threatologist.com, and they can download it themselves. There is a methodological appendix to the report that goes into a lot more detail about the challenges of monitoring the topic and the sources that are used. But first of all, I'd say that what you've described there about the changing media environment is absolutely accurate. When you go back to the Chechen Wars, you had a lot more Western attention, you had a lot more English language material. Personally, I don't use English language material because there's so little available in English these days that you can actually draw upon. But even in Russian, you've got a huge problem, because not only have you got kind of the censorship in a kind of direct sense, but also the very kind of much more controlled media environment, even when it's not kind of direct censorship, that limits the information. Russian national newspapers, for example, they used to have a lot more interest in what was happening in the region. They had people on the ground. And nowadays, if you look at what makes it into the national news, is predominantly security service statements. They don't have people on the ground reporting information. There are one or two sources that are good local media sources, and some of those are externally funded, like Radio Free Europe still has a good presence in, at least in its Russian language reporting. Caucasian Not is obviously one that most people who follow the region will be familiar with. They have very good sources, and I would say OC Media as well as another smaller independent outlet that is covering the region. But even them, they have difficulties verifying information. There's a lot of stuff that they can't say publicly, either because they can't verify it or because saying it would endanger their sources. And so it is a very difficult media environment, and I think that's something we kind of have to acknowledge as the starting point. In terms of what I did for this report, for the database that's behind it, I basically drew on 5 sources systematically, so drawing everything that those sources produced. Those were 2 national media outlets, which were Kommersant and Izvestia. The reason I picked those is because they pretty consistently report on what's happened, big events in the Caucasus, and they have good security services sources. So they're not producing non-partisan information, shall we say, but they are adding something to the picture. The 2 local sources are Caucasian Not and it's called Caucasus Reali, which is a Radio Free Europe source. And then as an official source, the National Anti-Terrorism Committee, which again will put out kind of like the official data. And then to those sources, I add the ones that I routinely monitor. So I monitor a huge range of sources that report on Russian security issues, and when incidents are reported, those are all included. What I do with that information is I collect all of the reports and then I break out the information that they report, and I record it in a database with many different fields that capture who the perpetrators were, who the targets were, where it happened, what types of weapons were used, and so forth and so forth. Now, I deliberately structure that data set around the source itself. So I don't claim that I have the ability to verify independently each incident, because from a resource perspective, that's simply not possible. I'm a one-person operation, and to be honest, even if I had the resources, it would be very difficult to do on a regular basis. You see terrorism and counter-terrorism incidents being reported months after the fact. So no one's even aware that they've happened, let alone is there an ability to verify them. So what I try to do is make the best use of the information that's available, but because verification is very difficult, being transparent about what the data set consists of, what it actually reflects, trying to capture the discrepancies between different reports. So sometimes the official sources themselves will give very different reports. That was seen quite clearly in the Makachkala and Derbent incidents, where they were all contradicting each other. That's why you have in my data set a huge range in casualty figures from 80 odd to 120 odd, because that's capturing the information. But trying to be clear about what information is there and making the data set reflective of the sources rather than an analytical judgment, and then applying the analytical judgment after the fact. Because I think we do have to acknowledge that there are limits to what we can do in terms of verification. There are limits to what we can do in terms of being able to kind of probe beyond the information that already exists. And this isn't unique to Russia. If you look at things like the Global Terrorism Database, for example, they try to do this tracking on a global scale. They miss plenty of incidents that would fall within my data set. But they try to solve this problem of verification by using multiple sources. So they'll say, okay, 3 sources have reported on this incident and therefore it happened. Doesn't really work in the Russian case, because when you look at the 3 reports, they're all citing the same source underneath. So, you know, you might have a report in Kommersant, you might have a report in Izvestia, you might have a report in Moskovsky Komsomolets, you might have a report from the local authorities, and they're all citing the exact same, and they use the exact same language, it's copy and paste of the same information. So you can't really get around it. And to a degree, pretending that that information is then verified is just misleading. I think it's more important to be transparent about, okay, this is the information that exists in the public domain, this is the shortcomings of that information, and this is where we're basing our picture off kind of the best available information. We're not claiming it's necessarily representative of everything. It's not necessarily perfect, but it's better than what exists when you don't have the data set. And that is something that a lot of people find very frustrating, because they want to get to something that they would call the truth. They want to get towards the facts. But actually, when you think about it, the perceptions of the security situation play a big role in the security situation itself. It feeds back into it. And people are basing their perceptions on imperfect information environments as well. So actually, even capturing the biases that exist, the narratives that exist, the misleading information that exists, the contradictions that exist, I would argue that actually has huge value and is as important as kind of unearthing some underlying kind of truth to data.
Thanks. I remember probably a week before or some days before what happened in Dagestan. There were a meeting of the National Anti-Terrorism Committee and local authorities in North Caucasus, and they stressed how safe was the situation in the North Caucasus, and they improved the security situation and measures after 2-3 days. There were the attacks in Dagestan. It was really interesting because in this case you can completely understand how sometimes it's really hard to rely on just on official sources. And also you are completely right when you say, when you read different sources, sometimes they have just one version, and usually the version is from the NAC, the National Anti-Terrorism Committee. They say, okay, this and that, and you can read always the same articles from different media, but probably you are right. Say, at least as an expert, you should just include this information, this piece of information in your methodology. And in this case, you can produce different scenarios and you can assess the security situation, even though I try to avoid the rumors from the central government's narrative or local narrative. So I completely agree with you, and thanks for giving us this overview, because I believe it's really, really important for people who want to operate like OSINT analysts regarding the Caucasus and the Russian Federation, because sometimes it's really hard to understand the truth, or it's very hard to prove that something is true or not.
Mm-hmm. And I think as well, like, this is something that becomes very unsatisfying to kind of the external observer. But if you are kind of systematic in the way that you approach these sources, if you monitor things routinely, there is a degree to which you just get very experienced in spotting the nonsense. For some reason, Skype's decided to give me the thumbs up there. It clearly agrees. Yeah. But just through that experience of monitoring media outlets and getting to know the patterns of how they report on things. And that works for kind of insurgent media as well. So, for example, I can tell you, every time that a major terrorist attack happened that was linked to the North Caucasus, Caucasus Center, which was the main rebel outlet, would put out a statement saying it's nothing to do with us. And they would do that for all of the suicide attacks that happened during the years of the Caucasus Emirate. And then a day later, they would put out a video claiming responsibility, because it was just kind of a default pattern. So you learn to then just ignore that, that kind of stepping back from authority as a characteristic of that source. It's what they would do as kind of like a reaction, and then they'd go, okay, it was us after all. Here's the evidence that we've got because someone has sent us the video proving it. And for all the sources you monitor, you eventually, the more you look at them, you get to know the patterns of what type of information they're relying on, how often that information turns out to be kind of accurate, who their sources are, who they're particularly well connected are. Because there's some, for example, Telegram accounts that are known to be connected to the Dagestani or the Russian security services. And so that when they put out information as kind of an independent source, you know exactly where it's coming from. So it's very difficult to kind of articulate that as a concrete methodology, but I think that's where kind of a degree of experience in looking at a problem actually is beneficial, because then over time you get to basically notice the particularly egregious things. So it doesn't mean you can spot everything, it doesn't mean you can resolve all these issues, but the more you look at something, the more you get kind of attuned to the nuances in the data, in the reporting, and you can start to see, okay, what is more reliable, what is less reliable, where are the biases, and so forth.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks again for your expertise and the time that you spend with us. I would like just to remind to our followers to become to join you in your newsletter, Threatologist. You can go, of course, to your website, or you can reach Mark different social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, and if I'm not mistaken. So Threatologist, if you want to discover more about Russia, the Caucasus, and the Russian security systems. Thanks again, Mark, to be our guest. It was really an interesting discussion regarding your report, regarding your expertise. Hope that we can have you again as our guest in the future. So I wish you, our followers and listeners, a good day, good also weekend, because we are close to the weekend. And I just hope that we can cover more and more the North Caucasus, because I believe that this region can really provide us good intelligence, and also one of the keys to understand